was talking with you and Jill. You said you were expecting to have a target on your back, but the intensity of some of it. Did you see the questions about your past positions from the perspective of race being as relevant as they are?
No, and I don't think they're relevant because they're taken out of context. What I didn't see is people who know me. I mean, they know me well. It's not like it's somebody who just came out of the blue, didn't know anything. But it's so easy to go back 30, 40, 50 years and take a context and take it completely out of context. And I mean, you know, I get all this information about other people's past and what they've done and not done. And, you know, I'm just not going to go there. If we keep doing that, that's, I mean, what we should be debating what we do from here. For example, this whole thing about race and busing. Well, you know, I think if you take a look, our positions aren't any different, as we're finding out.
With Senator Harris, who said she sees it as a tool, not a must in all circumstances.
Yeah, well, look at my record.
But I don't think busing is about policy, Mr. Vice President.
No, it's not.
I think it was about principle. When you look back at your record on it, you were not in favor of busing. It was a different time. There were different applications. Why not just own it and say,
here's the thing,
I was against it, but now I've changed?
I was in favor of busing that was de jure busing. That is, if a court ruled that there was a law passed or circumstance that a county, a city, a state did that prevented black folks from being somewhere, then that's wrong. You should bus. I even went so far in the middle of that busing controversy was saying I use helicopters if that was necessary to make the point. And we really got in a town meeting that got very hot. But what the issue is now is, for example, and it was then, voluntary busing. We supported it. We supported it then. And by the way, Barack and I, as president and vice president, we provided money for voluntary busing if cities want to do it.
I'm not questioning any of that.
No,
I'm saying that when you look back in the 70s, you said, I think busing doesn't work. It's an asinine concept.
Well, by the way,
you tried to pass bills that weren't for it.
Busing did not work. You had overwhelming response from the African-American community in my state. My state is the 8th largest black population in the country as a percent of population. They did not support it. They did not support it. Look, the question is, how do you equalize education in every area? And I put forward the most aggressive plan to do that, and I've been pushing it for a long time. For example, in Title I schools at disadvantage. I propose we go from $15 billion a year to $45 billion a year. We should bring people in, have preschool from 3, 4, 5 years old, before kindergarten. We should have, look, every child out there is capable, but they live in circumstances that make it difficult. For the time they get to school, they've heard 3, 4 million fewer words spoken. They're at a disadvantage.
I totally accept all of it.
That's number one. But number two, the idea right now, 65 out of 100 jobs in a study I did for the president point out you need something beyond a high school degree.
It's true.
So what are we doing? We're sitting around here as if it's an insoluble problem.
I get it on the policy. I never have viewed the busing back and forth in that debate as about policy or application of how to affect civil rights. It's about consistency and proving if you'll be better than what we're dealing with now in the White House, which is people won't tell the truth about things. If busing didn't work, then it made sense that you weren't for it back then. But why say you were for it?
Well,
why not just be straight about it and move on?
Because there's 3 different pieces. I was for voluntary busing. Number one, I was for busing where the court showed that, in fact, a legislative body took an action preventing black folks from going to a school. That is de jure, I know you know, de jure segregation. The difficult piece is, this is 50 years ago, people don't understand the context. The third one is, do you have an administration through their non-elected officials, the Department of Housing, decide every school should be equally balanced across the board? That's a different issue. And the way to deal with that problem is what I did from the time I was a kid. I got out of law school, came back, had a great job, became a public defender. I fought for putting housing in low-income housing in suburbia. I talked about eliminating redlining. I talked about school districts should be consolidated in ways that made sense. So, in fact,
why didn't you fight it like this in the debate?
In 30 seconds?
Hey, what happens most in a debate, Mr. Vice President? People blow their time cue. You're the only person I've ever seen on a debate stage say, I'm out of time.
Well, we never had a place where you have 30 seconds, man. What I didn't want to do is get in that scrum. Do you think the American public looked at that debate, take me out of it, and thought, boy, I really like the way that's being conducted? they're really showing themselves to do really well. Come on, man.
But they're going to come after you.
Sure, they're going to come after
Were
me.
you prepared for them to come after you?
I was prepared for them to come after me, but I wasn't prepared for the person coming at me the way she came out. She knew Bo. She knows me. But here's the deal. What I do know, and it's the good and the bad news, the American people think they know me, and they know me. Since that occurred, I had the most sought-after endorsement for the mayor of Atlanta, a black woman who's a great leader, Mayor Bottoms, endorsement. I've had numerous members of the Black Caucus endorsement.
You worried about the poll slippage with African Americans after the debate?
No. These folks just came. I'm making the point to you. I don't see it. People know who I am. I don't believe there's anybody out there that believes that I have anything other than a keen and consistent interest in making sure every child has. These are all our children.
Here's the question. Did you rewatch the debate?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
Well, I didn't have an opportunity to rewatch it. And besides, my measure is how people react outside, getting on a train, getting on a plane, walking through an airport, walking in a parade, just going to the grocery store. I got no sense. I really mean it. No sense.
Here's the tough question for Democrats. They need a warrior, okay? Because not to aggrandize, not to lionize, but this president knows how to fight in the ring one-on-one. Kamala Harris is friendly fire. Cory Booker is friendly fire. How can Democrats have confidence that you can take on the biggest and the baddest when you're having trouble sparring in party?
I don't think I'm having trouble sparring. It's how you want to spar. Look, I'm the guy at the time everybody talks about things that change. I took on same-sex marriage. I took on a whole range of issues. I took on arms control. I took on dealing with Russia with the arms control agreement. I took on Putin in terms of Iraq. In terms of what was going on in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I've taken on these leaders around the world. I'm the guy that's gone in and met them. I've taken on all these leaders. This is ironic. I've never been accused of not being able to spar. I've been accused of being too aggressive.
But the game has changed.
Well,
and you think that what's happening with Harris is anything compared to what would happen with you and this
no,
president?
No, but everybody knows who this guy is. Come on, man. Come on.
How do you beat him?
I beat him by just pointing out who I am and who he is and what we're for and what he's against. This guy is a divider in chief. This guy is acting with racist policies. This guy is moving to just foment hate, to split. That's the only way he can sustain himself.
Nothing about him worries you?
Oh, yeah, well, sure it worries me in the sense that I'm looking forward to this, man. You walk behind me in a debate. Come here, man. No, you think you know me too well. The idea that I'd be intimidated by Donald Trump, he's the bully that I knew my whole life. He's the bully that I've always stood up to. He's the bully I used to make fun when I was a kid and stutter and I smacked him in the mouth. Look, this is not. But I think the American people want a president who has some dignity, who has a value set, who is actually trying to restore the soul of this country. So when they turn on the television, they look up and their kids say, I want to be like that guy or that woman.
They're domestic agenda items I want to tick through.
Sure.
But you have made a big point of saying the threat here with the current administration is abroad.
Both.
What exactly bothers you abroad?
What bothers me abroad is, look, the idea that we can go it alone with no alliances for the next 20 or 30 years is a disaster. How are we going to deal with stateless terrorism without doing what I've been able to do with the president, put together coalitions of 50, 60 nations to take it on? I come out of a generation where we were trying to be the policeman of the world. We can't go in every place. We need allies. He is absolutely dissing them. He's embracing thugs. He's embracing Kim Jong-un, who is a thug. He's embracing Putin, who is a flat dictator. He's embracing people who, in fact, and he's stiff-arming our friends. He's threatening NATO to pull out of NATO. Come on.
He says he's gotten NATO to give in more money for their defense because of his tactics.
Oh, come on, man. And by the way, the idea that NATO let me put it this way. If he wins re-election, I promise you there'll be no NATO in 4 years or 5 years.
You think there'll be no more NATO if he's re-elected?
NATO. Look, I went to the conference that we have. It's called the Verkunda Conference. Used to be. The first speech stood up. the chancellor, the former chancellor of Germany, stands up. She says, we have to go it alone. We can't count on the United States. Why did we set up NATO, Chris? So no one nation could abuse the power in the region, in Europe, that would suck us in a way they did in World War I and World War II. It's being crushed. Look at what's happening with Putin. While Putin is trying to undo our elections, he is undoing elections in Europe. Look what's happened in Hungary. Look what's happened in Poland. Look what's happened in Moldova. Look what's happening. You think that would have happened on my watch or Barack's watch? You can't answer that, but I promise you it wouldn't have, and it didn't.
So with North Korea, the idea of reaching out, President Obama, Vice President Biden wanted to do more than that. The Republicans used to whack you on the head. You can't be nice to people who are our enemies. Hasn't this president done what you wanted to do by reaching out to Kim?
He did the exact opposite. He gave Kim everything that he wanted, legitimacy. He ended our relationship as a practical matter with South Korea and Japan as a united front and let China off the hook. He put us in a position where we say, by the way, I love the man. I know what he's doing. He hadn't done a thing. He hadn't done a thing, Kim Jong-un. And what have we done? We've suspended exercises. Look, I come out of the arms control era. Guess what? There's two ways you do this. You work or you defend. You say, hey, man, don't screw with us. You move, this is what's going to happen. This is going to happen. But in the meantime, what you do is you deal with your allies and also those who aren't with you. Do you think China wants any part of North Korea becoming a nuclear power?
So what do you do differently with North Korea and China?
With regard to North Korea, with China, I make it clear that we're going to move our defenses up as we did before, and we're going to make sure we have a capacity to deal with the near term. I'm going to let South Korea and Japan know we're there for them. We are their nuclear umbrella. We're there for them. And China understand, if you don't want us in your throat here, if you don't want us in your face, do something.
Do you stop the trade battle with China? Do you go back to TPP?
By the way, the idea that this trade battle makes any sense, is benefiting anybody, is absolutely ludicrous. And just ask the farmers here or around the world, around the United States, and the manufacturers. It's killing us. What we should do is we deal with China. I had a conversation with Xi Jinping before we left. And he said, well, remember they set up their no-fly zone? And I said, we're not going to pay attention to it. He said, what do you want me to do, just withdraw it? And I said, no, but just understand, we're just going to fly through. We fly a B-52 through it. We are a Pacific power. We're not going anywhere. Understand, and that's the reason why you have security, is because we've allowed stability in the region. They get it. But what they're doing now is we're not dealing with China's problem for us. China's problem is they're stealing intellectual secrets.
Yes.
They're cybersecurity. Deal the same way. You say you got to invest here in the United States and you want to be able to invest here, and you say we want to invest in China, but you got to have a 51% owner? No deal, man. Deal for deal.
This administration's fighting that same fight, isn't it?
But they're not. No, they're fighting in trade. And Trump thinks it's about trade deficits and trade surpluses. It's not about that. Look, while he's tweeting, China is going to own the 5G market. While, in fact, they're spending billions in artificial intelligence. What are we doing? They're doing a whole lot of things that make no sense for us to stand still.
What would you do differently with North Korea? Would you slam the door on them again?
Yeah, I'd make it real clear. Look, you want to talk, you want to deal with us, you want sanctions lifted, show me something ahead of time.
They haven't tested a big bad missile.
And the reason why they haven't tested is they have it all done. They're sitting there with missiles that have capacity and nuclear capacity right now. So they're not giving up anything.
All right, he has given us a lot of food for thought this Friday morning. So we have so much to talk about and dive into here. We'll have much more of our exclusive interview with Joe Biden throughout the morning. And in our next hour, the former vice president is going to lay out his health care plan. He's going to discuss the crisis at the border, what he thinks should be done about it, and talk of a potential running mate. All right, we just heard former Vice President Biden's exclusive interview with Chris Cuomo. In it, he talked about the controversy over school busing and race relations that led to that much-discussed moment on the debate stage. Listen to this.
Did you see the questions about your past positions from the perspective of race being as relevant as they are?
No, and I don't think they're relevant because they're taken out of context. What I didn't see is people who know me. I mean, they know me well. It's not like, it's somebody who just came out of the blue, didn't know anything. But it's so easy to go back 30, 40, 50 years and take a context and take it completely out of context. Well, this whole thing about race and busing, well, you know, I think if you take a look, our positions aren't any different, as we're finding out.
All right, we want to bring in Errol Lewis, CNN political commentator, Arlette Saenz, CNN political reporter who has followed Joe Biden on the campaign trail, and Joe Lockhart, former White House press secretary under President Bill Clinton. Great to see all of you. Thank you for being here early on this Friday morning. So, Joe, that was Joe Biden explaining himself about how it sounds like he was surprised by the attack coming from Kamala Harris. Mostly he sort of took it personally, that he didn't think that she should be going after him. And he did, later in the interview, get into the nuance of busing and clarified his position that he was against the federal mandate, but not against the voluntary style busing that she ended up going to school as a result of in Berkeley. What did you think of that?
I think it was a pretty interesting answer. I think, and it demonstrates, I think, Biden's strategy. He's not going to roll over, but he's not going to, as he said in the interview, get into the scrum. He's going to stay above the scrum. I think what he was really saying there was what Kamala Harris did was a cheap shot. She attacked him for a position that she herself has and did it in a very personal and emotional way. And he said he was surprised by that because people know him. I think you're going to find that he's going to deflect a lot of these attacks by saying people are just playing politics. Voters, you know me, you know what I can do, you know what kind of man I am. And that's how he's going to try to thread this needle of playing defense where he needs to, but trying to stay above the fray.
Errol, you know, perspective's the thing we have least of in our politics. Joe Biden tried to impose some on the issue of busing, saying, look, he was in favor of it when it was a court order. He was in favor of it in school districts, not a federal mandate. It wasn't popular and it wasn't working. Were you convinced? Were you convinced by his answer?
Personally, not particularly, in part because the whole thing about desegregating this country, which is one of the glories of the Democratic Party, one of the things they should be most proud of, one of the parts of the legacy he should not be trying to backpedal or walk away from. Well, one singular part of it is that you did it whether or not it was popular. You know, so for Joe Biden to say, well, black families in Wilmington or wherever weren't all that thrilled about it. Okay, well, that's great. But we were talking about a constitutional principle, about a broad transformation of society, and about doing something that was, in fact, tough and not all that popular. So I really didn't want to hear too much more about it. And I think Joe Biden should try and pivot off it. But, look, he is trying to stay above the fray. He's trying to get to the general election without the messiness of the primary. And I think that's a mistake on his part, that it's not necessarily going to work. And Kamala Harris showed that it's not going to work. There's a very restive Democratic coalition out there. It includes college-educated women and millennials and environmentalists and LGBTQ families and union households. And you've got to speak to all of them. You can't just kind of skate past and say, oh, everybody knows me. Let's get to the general election. I don't think that's going to work.
So, Arlette, describe if there has been a strategy shift from the former vice president since the debates. I mean, first of all, sitting down with CNN. He doesn't do many of these one-on-one interviews. So describe what's happening in the campaign and if something has changed.
Well, on this issue of busing, it was clear that the campaign did want to engage in it since they brought up Harris's recent explanations. And you're seeing Biden trying to show that he wants to move past it, trying to turn the corner, talking about how the Democratic candidates need to start talking about issues of the current environment and of the future. But I've been following Joe Biden for these past 2 days as he's been here in Iowa, this early caucus state. And yesterday in the parade, he marched in a parade, really ran through a parade in Independence, Iowa, zigzagged across the parade route, was holding babies at one point, glad-handing people. He was literally running. There was one point where I asked him, are you training for this parade? And he said, oh, I just love parades, and kind of dashed off from me. But he has been having a few more interactions with media. On Wednesday night, he stopped for questions when I asked him. Yesterday along the parade route, he was answering reporters' questions as well as holding a gaggle. We're going to see if this accessibility continues going forward. He's going to be in Houston later today and South Carolina over the weekend, which is really critical to Biden's argument, particularly among black voters as he's courting them in that state.
So the Rose Garden strategy seems to be a thing of the past, more of an on-the-road strategy from Joe Biden. But he definitely did try to keep his fire focused primarily on President Trump and the argument of what some folks would call simply electability, going toe-to-toe, mano a mano. Let's take a look at that sound.
How do you beat him?
I beat him by just pointing out who I am and who he is and what we're for and what he's against. This guy is a divider in chief. This guy is acting with racist policies. I'm looking forward to this, man. You walk behind me in a debate. Come here, man. No, you think you know me too well. I mean, the idea that I'd be intimidated by Donald Trump, he's the bully that I knew my whole life. He's the bully that I've always stood up to.
Joe Lockhart, you're the comms guy. Come on, man. Is that strategy going to work for Joe Biden?
I think it's part of the strategy. I think he certainly is the candidate that a lot of Democrats think that while he may not be perfect, he provides some certainty, and the fact that he has been tested. But he's got to do a whole lot more. I agree with Errol on the idea that he's got to go out and appeal to multiple constituencies in the Democratic Party. And that's what he'll talk about. I assume he's talked about it, and you'll hear it in the next couple hours here on New Day, and voters will make a judgment. The one thing I would say, going back to busing just for a second, is there isn't a candidate in this race on either party now who has a plan to mandate federal busing. So in many ways, it's a symbolic issue, but it is not a practical issue for voters going forward. And I think everyone agrees that moving past it is in the interest of all of the Democratic field, but particularly Joe Biden.
Errol, one thing that I was struck by was how well Joe Biden does in this format. That sit down with Chris. Not every format is for every person. And so Kamala Harris really seemed to thrive in the, stage of 10. She was able to kind of upstage people, and she was able to, I would say, manipulate that format in a certain way that made her shine. This is his format, I would say, because that's where he shows his institutional knowledge. And he can speak on North Korea and how he remembers what happened with China and Russia and how we got here. What did you think about just how he presented himself?
Yeah, and I think that is certainly true, Allison, but I'd put a big caveat there, which is that we know from polls, from past elections, from what people are telling pollsters now, this is, whether or not Russia's been meddling in Hungary is not going to move voters, certainly not at the primary stage of this election. So one wonders if what is the essence of Joe Biden, which is that he's got all of this experience, it can become a distraction and it can become a burden. And I would urge him, if I were on his team, I would certainly urge him to say less about that, frankly. Or if there's going to be a foreign policy question, pivot immediately to the chaos that's happening at the border, to the fact that what he talks about, being able to rally the nations, lead the free world, and develop policies that will support a safer and more secure world are not being applied in Latin America. I would always tell him, you got to bring it closer to home for the Democratic coalition. That's what really people want to hear about.
But Arlette, final word to you. What are you hearing from folks in Iowa? Because clearly that executive experience, he talks about going toe-to-toe with thugs and really prescribes a different path with North Korea, that kind of specifics. Does that resonate with voters, at least to the extent that they can imagine him being commander-in-chief?
Well, that's something that I have heard from voters here in Iowa and also in other states like New Hampshire and South Carolina. They point, as well as Biden's allies, that he does have that experience. He has been as close as you can to the presidency. And one thing that I heard over and over again at these Biden events in the past 2 days is that people who are attending those events, even if they're undecided, they are focused on finding someone that can defeat President Trump. And I think right now what Biden is trying to do after that debate is quell some of those concerns that he may not be able to take on Trump if he can't even face that friendly fire from his fellow Democrats.
All right. Joe, Arlette, Errol, thank you all very much. So also,
You versus the rest of the field. On the economy, they're all going big. 70% tax rates, free college, re-architecture of the economy, a forgiving debt. for college, which happens to be the biggest asset on the American government's balance sheet. You do not believe in those things.
I don't believe in the way they're doing that. For example, I think there should be health care for everyone. I have a plan how to do that that's rational and will cost a hell of a lot less and will work. In terms of...
Too incremental?
No, it's not incremental. It's bold.
Would you bring back the individual mandate?
Pardon me?
Would you bring back the individual mandate?
Yes, I bring back the individual mandate.
Think that'll be popular?
Well, it's not. Yes, now it would be compared to what's being offered. And here's the deal, Chris. We're in a situation where if you provide an option for anybody who, in fact, wants to buy into Medicare for all, they can buy in. They buy in. And they can do it. But if they like their employer-based insurance, which a lot of unions broke their neck to get, a lot of people like they shouldn't have to give it up. The flip of that is, if you don't go my way, and you go their way, you have to give up all of that. And what's going to happen when you have 300 million people landing on a health care plan? How long is that going to take? What's it going to do? And in the meantime, a lot of people are going to be in trouble. In terms of the economy, Chris, I've been proposing for a long time. Look, I know I'm middle-class Joe. I get that part. It's not meant I'm sophisticated. It meant the middle class built this country. You didn't have Wall Street build this country. And how'd they do it? You gave people a chance. You allowed them to maintain their dignity. And how'd they do it? How can you have dignity without having health care? How can you have dignity without having access to an education? How can you have dignity unless you can live in a neighborhood that's not fouled by the environment and what's going on?
How do you convince the party that these more advanced ideas, like all in on Medicare for all, that matter to them?
Advanced.
But they're popular in the party.
Well, by the way, watch. That's what this election is about. I'm happy to debate that issue and all those issues with my friends, because guess what? Again, look who won the races. Look who won last time out. We had, and by the way, I think Ocasio-Cortez is a brilliant, bright woman, but she won a primary. In the general election fights, who won? Mainstream Democrats who are very progressive on social issues and very strong on education, health care. Look, my North Star is the middle class. When the middle class does well, everybody does well.
How do you do better for them economically, if not with these 70% tax rates?
Well, three things. One, I do raise the tax rate to 39.5%. I do, in fact, eliminate the ability for them to write off capital gains the way they do now. I would raise billions of dollars, raise the corporate tax rate from 20 to 28%. It was 36 to 28%. That raised billions of dollars.
Trump will say, but that's what brought the economy up to where it is those tax cuts.
Ask these people who work in this restaurant how that economy came up for them. Ask them how good they feel about it. Ask them how the stock market has really helped them. Ask how driving us $2 trillion greater in debt has done anything for them.
On health care, do you believe that undocumented people should have health care in this country?
I think undocumented people need to have a means by which they can be covered when they're sick. And so the idea is that's what I think we should be doing by building more clinics around the country, not just for undocumented, for other people. When they're ill, when they're sick, people need, this is just common decency. You're not going to let somebody.
Some popular.
Well, I know it
well
is.
Over 50% of people polled say undocumented people here should not have health care on our dime.
Well, let me tell you something. In an emergency, they should have health care. Everybody should. Anybody here in the country. How do you say, you're undocumented, I'm going to let you die, man? What are you going to do? The idea that, I hear this stuff about how, they're killing Social Security, et cetera. Those who have jobs, guess what? They've increased the lifespan of Social Security by close to 12 years. We got this. This is part of what Trump is playing on. He's playing.
It works for him, this issue, the idea of law and order versus a left that seems like it's open borders because it means it's lawless. You have people who are running close to you now who are saying decriminalize coming into the country illegally. Do you believe that should be decriminalized?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think people should have to get in line. But if people are coming because they're actually seeking asylum, they should have a chance to make their case. I would be surging, as we did, and Barack and I did, surging folks to the border to make those concrete decisions. Look, the other thing, Chris, is why are they coming? The reason the vast majority of these people are coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador is because they're in trouble. Crime rates are high. Education is terrible. In Guatemala, you can't turn on a light switch in half of the mountain. And so what do? I put together a $740 million program with Republicans, I might add. at the very end saying, we'll make a deal with you. You do the following things to make your country better so people don't leave, and we will help you do that. Just like we did in Colombia. What did we do in Colombia? We went down and said, okay, and I was one of the architects of Plan Colombia. I said, here's the deal. If you have all these crooked cops, all these federal police, we're sending our FBI down. You let us put them through lie detector tests. Let us tell you who you should fire and tell you the kind of people you should hire. They did, and began to change. So we can do so much if we're committed.
What do you say to the people in party right now when polled who say, yeah, I like Joe Biden, but I think that his ideas are the old ideas. The new ideas, I see a Warren, I see a Sanders, I see a Harris. You poll lower than them. You poll lower than them on ideas for the future. What do you say to them?
I say to them, take a look at my ideas. Take a look at my ideas. I haven't seen those polls. I haven't seen where people say, what I've seen around the country is the vast majority of Democrats are where I am on the issues. Mm-hmm. We've got to be aggressive. And they're big ideas. The big idea on education, on health care, on dealing with the environment. I mean, it's just, I love how, you know, all of a sudden, I wish I'd been labeled as moderate when I was running in Delaware back in the days when it was.
80% of your party says it's center left.
No, I am center left.
Farther left is getting more attention. It's getting amplified.
It is. Look,
there's a disconnect.
Look, it's center left. That's where I am. Where it's not is way left. Now look, but that's what we can find out. That's what this debate is about.
Do you think you need, if you win the nomination, to have a female VP?
I think it'd be great to have a female VP. And if I don't win, it'd be great to have a female president. But the question is, whose issues are best prepared in their wheelhouse? They've demonstrated they know how to deal with them.
Would you consider not having a woman as VP?
I would, look, here's the first thing about being a VP I've learned. And that is that in today's environment, there's so much a president has on his or her plate. They need someone they completely trust, that they're simpatico with, have the same approach, political approach, and you can delegate significant authority. The president, when he delegated authority to me from the moonshot to Ukraine, he gave me the authority to make decisions. Because I knew where he was. He knew that I knew something about it, and he knew we were simpatico. And so that's what I'm looking for.
Do you think a Democrat ticket can win without a woman in one of the two slots?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, but I don't think that. I think it helps having a woman on the ticket. And there's a lot of really qualified women out there.
Is Kamala Harris, assuming she doesn't win outright, is she still somebody you would consider as a running mate?
Look, one of the things I'm not going to get into, because it got used before, is when I was asked, I don't even have the nomination, and I'm presuming who I might pick as a vice president. That's easily flipped on me and saying, well, Biden's being arrogant. Biden thinks I'll have him as my vice president. So I'm not going to comment on any individual. A woman came up to me, I guess it was, I don't know, a month ago, I guess I was in New Hampshire, said,
all right, I'm almost done.
Why shouldn't I vote for a woman? And I said, you should. If you think that person is most qualified at the moment, right now, to deal with our problem, vote. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't vote for women. Look, I have spent my career from writing the Violence Against Women Act before that to say my daughters and granddaughters can do anything, and I mean anything, anything that a man can do, anything. And so I don't have a doubt in my mind. And if I started naming some of the people around the country, women who are not running for president as well, who are fully qualified to be vice president, again, he's awful presumptuous, man, and he's awful presumptuous. So there's a lot of really qualified women out there.
In terms of, last question, in terms of what we haven't seen from Joe Biden yet.
Can you clear that window, please?
I remember hey, Jill, last question, I promise. Okay.
Okay, well, we'll be there.
Last question, I promise. The last thing I remember talking to him about politically with you, Bo, was, what is the quality? Because he was asking me about, what do you take from your father and this? What did Andrew take? Bo Biden said to me, nobody fights like my father. What does that mean to you, to fight harder than anybody else?
I think it means two things. One, to fight without being personal, to fight and convince. The role of a president is to persuade. not just go out and fight. If they want someone with a clenched fist, bare knuckle fight, closed hand, closed heart, they got one of those guys right now. That's not me. I have been pretty darn good at bringing people together. The whole idea of America is that when we're together, there's not a damn thing we can't do. And look, the most incredible response I always get for the last 3 years is when I talk about how optimistic am I about the future. People know it. They feel it. They know it. They understand it. And we can't stay in this state. What are we going to do? What are we going to do if we can't get along better? And part of it is persuasion. And people looking at you say, I know what he means. He'll stay with what he says, and he'll do what he says he's going to do. And I think that's part of leading. We'll soon find out.
Thank you for the time.
Really interesting stuff. Interesting stylistically, interesting substantively. So we will dive into Joe Biden's ideas and his plans and his campaign strategy. Our 2020 campaign reporters are going to weigh in next. Okay, CNN's exclusive interview with former Vice President Joe Biden is chock full of headlines. Biden discussed his health care plan and whether undocumented immigrants should be covered. Here's that moment.
On health care, do you believe that undocumented people should have health care in this country?
I think undocumented people need to have a means by which they can be covered when they're sick. And so the idea is that's what I think we should be doing by building more clinics around the country, not just for undocumented, for other people. When they're ill, when they're sick, people need, this is just common decency. You're not going to let somebody.
Some popular.
Well, I know it
Well
is.
over 50% of people polled say undocumented people here should not have health care on our dime.
Well, let me tell you something. In an emergency, they should have health care. Everybody should. Anybody here in the country. How do you say, you're undocumented, I'm going to let you die, man?
Let's talk about this and so much more. We have Rebecca Buck and Arlette Saenz, CNN political reporters. Arlette has followed the Biden campaign all along the trail. We also have Tolu Olorunipa, White House correspondent for The Washington Post. Great to have all of you help us dissect everything that the former vice president said in this interview. Let's start there, Tolu. So basically, he's saying, that there was that moment that everybody on stage raised their hand in the debate for would you insure undocumented immigrants. And Joe Biden was not the first hand up. And his was the first hand down, actually. So there was a feeling of, did he reluctantly join the pack there? So here he clarified, and it sounds like what he's saying is that for catastrophic care, he believes in ensuring people for catastrophic care because, as he said, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? I'm going to let you die, man?
Yeah, this is actually very similar to something President Trump said during the 2016 race, where he was talking about health care and providing universal health care. And he said, I'm not going to let people die in the streets. And it seems like Joe Biden, who said during this interview, I am center left, is sort of staking out a clear position and adding some nuance to show that he's not as far left as the rest of the field, that he is basically trying to win over some of those Trump voters by saying, listen, we're not going to let people die in the streets. We can be compassionate, but not saying that we're going to give a government health care plan, government-funded health care to undocumented immigrants. But in an emergency situation where people are dying on the streets or really in a tough place, then we can provide health care for people even if they don't have documents, even if they don't have papers. So it does seem like he's adding some additional context, additional nuance, and pulling himself back from that far left position that he seemed to embrace during the debates where everyone raised their hands and President Trump seized on it by saying, listen, all of the Democrats want to give taxpayer-funded health care to undocumented immigrants. Joe Biden seems to be saying, listen, I support taking care of people, being compassionate, but we're not going to provide a full slate of benefits for people who don't have papers.
And Tolu, that's a great example of a policy-specific example of the larger fight for the Democratic Party that's going on. And Rebecca, Joe Biden has been positioned as someone who's a centrist on the right of his party, respectively. You've covered Congress, and so you know that, if you look back at his voting record in 2007, the National Journal did an analysis saying he was the third most liberal senator. So is this a case of the Democratic Party moving so far left that it's moved him by, or is it a case of the far left just having a louder voice than the rank and file?
You know, I think it's the latter, that right now the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is incredibly vocal, incredibly powerful in Washington. But when you look at the polling that we've seen throughout this election cycle, looking issue by issue where Democratic voters are, and also do they identify more as moderate centrist Democrats or liberal Democrats, you actually see that the Democratic voters still are, by and large, quite moderate. And so this is Joe Biden's case that he's been making as to why he is the best candidate to be the Democratic nominee and take the party into the general election, because many Democratic voters out there across the country still are quite moderate. They aren't as far left as some of the conversation we've been hearing in Washington, for example. And he is sort of getting the big share of these moderate voters at this point. But as we've seen in the polling, his lead is very tenuous, very fragile at this point. And so you have Kamala Harris and others trying to get that moderate piece of the Democratic vote. And that was exactly why she made the play she did in the debate.
He spoke directly to that. So, Arlette, we heard the former vice president tell Chris about how basically he believes being moderate is the way to go and the winning strategy. So let's listen to that moment.
Look who won the races. Look who won last time out. We had, and by the way, I think Ocasio-Cortez is a brilliant, bright woman, but she won a primary. In the general election fights, who won? Mainstream Democrats who are very progressive on social issues and very strong on education, health care. Look, my North Star is the middle class. When the middle class does well, everybody does well.
So, Arlette, that sounds like that will be his kind of overarching message for his campaign.
Yeah, it really is, Allison. And you've now heard Biden basically prescribe these two brands to himself. One, that he's center left, and two, that he's an Obama-Biden Democrat. And so going forward, and as you have seen throughout this campaign, Biden has really pushed back against that notion that there has been this leftward tilt in the party. He had also talked about how Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a brilliant and bright woman, but he just doesn't think that the party has gone that far left. As you have heard him also say, he has made that argument that there are very loud voices in the Democratic, on the leftward side of the party. But going forward, you know, Biden, he has said that he doesn't want to make any of these criticisms personal, but he's also starting to drill in on some of those issues. You've seen him really keep his focus on President Trump throughout this campaign, but in that interview, he's staking out some very clear policy differences when it comes to Medicare for all, also decriminalizing border crossing. That's something that former HUD Secretary Julian Castro has really led on, that Biden is now pushing back against. So you're finally starting to see him really trying to make that differentiation between himself and those other Democratic candidates, as he has to get through them first in order to get to President Trump.
That was a fascinating point he kept making. I'm a fighter, but without making it personal. A president needs to be a persuader. Tolu, one of the most fascinating moments of that particular segment of the interview is when he talks about what he might be looking for in a VP. Let's take a listen.
Do you think you need, if you win the nomination, to have a female VP?
I think it'd be great to have a female VP, and if I don't win, it'd be great to have a female president.
Do you think a Democrat ticket can win without a woman in one of the two slots?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, but I don't think that. I think it helps having a woman on the ticket. And there's a lot of really qualified women out there.
Tolu, is that almost a presumptuous question to follow on? Does Biden run a risk of getting too detailed on that kind of a conversation at this point?
Yeah, you could sort of see the wheels spinning in his head and not wanting to go too far in answering that question and deciding whether or not to name any names or whether or not to sort of engage with the question of whether or not he would support Senator Harris as a potential VP. He had talked about that in the past, and he got a little bit of pushback for that, and sort of seeming presumptuous, seeming as if he had already believed himself to be the nominee. In this case, he sort of stopped himself from going that far and just saying that there are tons of qualified women who could be the vice president, and also even sort of giving a nod saying that if he did not win the nomination, that he'd love to see a female presidential nominee. So it did seem like he was sort of worried about being seen as being too presumptuous there and decided not to fully engage and used it as an opportunity to speak to the women voters who are considering him, but also considering the history of potentially having the first female president. The president or the vice president wanted to show that he supports those voters either choosing him or potentially choosing a woman to be the nominee instead.
Rebecca, I want to talk about style for a second. There's a lot of substance, obviously, in this interview, but stylistically, not every format is for every candidate. And Joe Biden seems to really come alive in that particular format with Chris Cuomo. His eyes were bright. He looked energetic. He was able to kind of show off his institutional base of knowledge from NATO to North Korea to Russia, because he has experience with all of those countries. And he was able to kind of tout that in a way that somehow on stage with 10 other people, he seemed deferential. You know, he says in this interview, he didn't want to engage in the scrum, but some people rose to the occasion of engaging in the scrum. You know, that debate stage was Kamala Harris's format, I would say. And so what was your impression of how Joe Biden will come off to voters in this interview?
Well, you know, he came off, I think, so much better than he did on the debate stage, than he has in some of the early cycles, news cycles of this Democratic primary. And so it begs the question, why hasn't he been doing more one-on-one sit-down interviews like this? Why hasn't he been going out there to present his story, to explain his positions, to defend his positions in a way that wasn't as confrontational as what you might see on the debate stage? You know, I think this format does him a lot of favors. And he's been trying in this race to sort of, as you suggested, remain above the fray, to present himself as a front runner, as a statesman, as someone who's above all of the squabbling of the Democratic primary with 24 candidates. But we're seeing that he hasn't been succeeding in that. And so I think this shows he needs to engage a little bit more. He needs to get out there.
It's a fascinating, important interview by our friend Chris Cuomo. My guess is we will be seeing more of it. Rebecca Buck in Houston, where Vice President Biden will be speaking at the National Education Association later today, along with many other candidates. Arlette Toulouse, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're just waking up, we're going to play our entire interview with Joe Biden in the next hour.
Former Vice President Joe Biden talks to CNN exclusively about his ongoing squabble with Senator Kamala Harris over busing and race that started in last week's debate.
This whole thing about race and busing, well, you know, I think if you take a look, our positions aren't any different, as we're finding out.
Were you prepared for them to come after you?
I was prepared for them to come after me, but I wasn't prepared for the person coming at me the way she came out. She knew Bo, she knows me.
Joining us now is Senator Kamala Harris's Communications Director, Lily Adams. Good morning, Lily.
Hey, good morning. Good to be with you. Happy July 4th.
Thank you. You too. Great to have you on this post-July 4th morning. So today, it sounds as though Senator Kamala Harris's position and former VP Biden's position on busing is not as different as we thought it was on the debate stage. Is Senator Harris, does she believe in federal mandates for busing or not?
Well, what she said in the debate is that she did believe that back in 1969 and 1970, when she was being bused to school, that federally mandated busing was essential. And frankly, most school segregation and integration experts agree. It was fundamentally important. Now, what she said, and she articulated yesterday when she was in, I think, Indianola in Iowa, is that now we're in 2019, which is not 1969, thank goodness. And so we need new tools now. Now, I will say, Vice President Biden seems to stand by his opposition to busing from back in 1969. I couldn't really tell from his interview. It seemed like Chris was trying to pin him down. But that is a fundamental, point of disagreement on his record that Senator Harris highlighted in the debate, and that still remains a point of disagreement.
Well,
and that's
sort
fine.
of.
That's what campaigns are about.
Understood. But let me just clarify, because I don't think that this is clear. It sounds like what he's saying is that he was opposed to federally mandated busing. However, he was in favor of the locally decided busing, which Kamala Harris, as a young girl, was part of. That Berkeley decided to do that. And he said that he never disagreed with that, and he supported it. And now it sounds like what she is saying is that she believes in the locally decided busing as well.
No, Allison, what she said in the debate is that there are times when the federal government needs to intervene, like in the 60s and the 70s, when frankly there were local opposition to a lot of the busing. And I just want to, I think you're getting sort of lost in the tactics here, but the point of busing back in the 60s and 70s was integration. It was the way that we were integrating schools so that Black children and white children could learn together. And Vice President Biden has made his position pretty clear. He called it an asinine concept. She believes that there was a massive role for the federal government to work to integrate schools through federally mandated busing back then. But what she's saying, and maybe the vice president now agrees with this, is that now in 2019, 40 plus years later, there are different tactics that we need to use, like increasing the use of magnet schools, like taking on the reform of federal zoning laws, like making sure that school boundaries are drawn so that diverse classrooms are made up. So these are, there's just a difference of sort of an opinion on the record, but that's what campaigns are about, is about talking about people's record, it's about talking about people's ideas. And so her debate exchange with Vice President Biden, I think, remains a disagreement.
And it also sounded during the debate as though she felt that he should not have worked with those segregationist senators. Is that accurate?
Yeah, what she said is that when she's all for reaching across the aisle, she's all for working with people who disagree with him, but holding up segregationist senators who frankly dedicated their lives to the cause of segregation is not what we should be doing as a model for how to work together. These were folks who, if they had had their way, she would not be a senator. And so that's all she was saying, that, there are plenty of Republicans we can talk about working with who would be great. John McCain, the senator has a bill with Rand Paul. There are certainly ways that we can get along with people that we mostly disagree with, but segregationist senators, I think, is not who we should be holding up as a model for how to work together. And she and Senator Booker, I think, made their points very clear on this. And that's just where they stand.
In this interview of Vice President Biden with Chris Cuomo, it sounded like Vice President Biden took it personally, that he felt that Senator Harris sort of glossed over the nuances of his position in a way that felt like a personal attack, and almost that she knew him better than that to have gone for that. What's her response? Was that, I don't want to use the word low blow because he didn't use the word low blow, but it sounded like he felt it was an unnecessary personal attack.
Well, I don't think it was a personal attack at all. In fact, she starts off her comments in the debate by saying and affirming that she doesn't believe that the vice president is racist, and she's always had respect for the vice president. So I can't speak to why he was or wasn't prepared. That's for him and his team to decide and to explain. But what she was pointing out was a very real disagreement on the record. These are on decisions and actions that he made. This is what a presidential debate is. It's to decide who has the record, who has the ideas, who has the vision to lead the party against Donald Trump. And so I think to say that his record is not fair game or people's record is not fair game, frankly, is unrealistic. I think that the vice president talks a lot about his record. So does Kamala Harris. That's what they should do. And they're going to point out disagreements where there are disagreements.
I mean, one of the ironies of all of this talk that we've had for the past week is that busing is not at the top of any voter's list of top priorities. And yet we've gone back and looked at the record and really dissected it. And so what does she say to critics who say that this was all really a distraction?
Well, I think it was a moment in the debate, and frankly, I don't think you and I would be talking about it today if Vice President Biden's team hadn't been attacking Senator Harris over the weekend or over the July 4th holiday. So I think we are happy to talk about visions for how we integrate our schools. We're happy to talk about her vision for how we build a better middle class. We're happy to talk about what she wants to do on foreign policy. So we're more than happy to continue to talk about the issues. She did multiple events in Iowa yesterday where she got questions on everything from the environment to criminal justice reform. To what we're going to do to beat Donald Trump in November of 2020. So she'll continue to talk to voters all across the country.
Lily Adams, thank you very much for coming on and helping clarify Senator Harris's position on all of this. Great to talk to you.
Great to see you. Yeah.